Welcome to another journey through the quieter corridors of history, where we'll spend the next few hours together, exploring the fascinating world of historical myths that have been thoroughly debunked by modern scholarship. Tonight, you'll discover the truth behind 4 of history's most persistent misconceptions, learning how these myths originated, why they spread, and what the actual historical evidence reveals. Our 4 stories will take us from the medieval monasteries where scholars calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, to the salons of 18th century France, where a queen's reputation was destroyed by words she never spoke, to the windswept battlefields of Scandinavia, where warriors fought without the horned helmets of legend, and finally to the drawing rooms of early 19th century Britain, where a cartoonist's pen created one of history's most enduring physical stereotypes. Each story reveals not just the truth behind the myth, but the human tendency to prefer dramatic fiction over mundane reality and how these preferences shape our understanding of the past. In the year 1271, a young Venetian named Marco Polo departed from his home city carrying with him not just silk and spices for trade, but something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that the Earth was a sphere. As his ship navigated the Mediterranean, Polo understood that the horizon's curve was not merely a trick of the eye, but evidence of the world's spherical nature. He was not alone in this understanding. From the monasteries of Ireland to the madrasas of Cordoba, from the universities of Paris to the courts of Constantinople, the educated minds of the medieval world shared a common certainty: the Earth was round. This knowledge was so fundamental to medieval education that it formed the basis of their cosmology, their navigation, their theology, and their understanding of geography. Yet today, centuries later, we persist in believing that our medieval ancestors were somehow too primitive, too superstitious, too limited in their thinking to grasp what seems obvious to us. This misconception is not just wrong, it's backwards. The medieval scholars who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable precision, who understood the mechanics of lunar eclipses, who navigated vast distances across unfamiliar seas, were far more sophisticated in their understanding of the natural world than the myth suggests. The evidence for medieval understanding of the Earth's spherical nature is overwhelming and comes from multiple sources, across different cultures and time periods. In the Islamic world, scholars like al-Biruni calculated the Earth's circumference in 1025 CE with an error of only 31 kilometers. His method was elegant in its simplicity. He measured the angle of a mountain peak from 2 different locations and used trigonometry to determine the Earth's curvature. The result was more accurate than any measurement attempted in Europe until the 18th century. In Christian Europe, the picture was equally clear. The Venerable Bede, writing in 8th century England, described the Earth as a sphere hanging in space. He calculated the tide's relationship to the moon's phases and understood that the Earth's rotation caused day and night. His contemporaries shared this knowledge. Archbishop Rabbonius Maurus of Mainz, writing in the 9th century, described the Earth as round like a ball, and explained how different parts of the world experienced different seasons simultaneously. The monasteries that the European landscape were not just centers of prayer, but of learning. The monks who painstakingly copied manuscripts understood what they were preserving. Works by Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Pliny, the elder, all of whom described a spherical Earth, were standard texts in monastic libraries. The 12th century monk Honorius of Autun wrote that the Earth is round like a ball, while the 13th century scholar Bartholomew the Englishman explained that the Earth is round and is in the middle of the firmament. Perhaps most tellingly, the medieval maps themselves reveal the truth. The famous Mappa Mundi, those circular medieval world maps, were not attempts to show the Earth as flat. They were artistic representations of a spherical world projected onto a flat surface, much like our modern world maps. The map makers understood the challenge of representing a three-dimensional sphere on a two-dimensional surface, and they developed conventions to deal with this problem. The two maps, with their distinctive T-shaped division of the known world, were symbolic representations, not literal geographic depictions. The universities that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries made the spherical Earth a cornerstone of their curriculum. Students at the University of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna learned about the Earth's spherical nature as part of their basic education. The textbooks they used, such as John of Sacrobosco's De Sphera Mundi, On the Sphere of the World, written around 1230, were explicit in their descriptions of the Earth's roundness. Sacrobosco explained how ships' masts appeared before their hulls when approaching from the sea, how the North Star appeared higher in the sky as one traveled north, and how lunar eclipses were caused by the Earth's round shadow. The evidence was not merely theoretical. Medieval travelers regularly demonstrated their understanding of the Earth's spherical nature through their journeys. The Vikings, those supposedly barbaric raiders from the north, navigated the Atlantic Ocean using sophisticated understanding of celestial navigation that required knowledge of the Earth's spherical nature. They reached Greenland, Iceland, and even North America using techniques that would have been impossible if they believed the Earth was flat. In the Islamic world, the geographer Al-Idrisi created detailed maps for King Roger II of Sicily in 1154 that showed the Earth's spherical nature. His maps were so accurate that they were used by European navigators for centuries. The Islamic tradition of pilgrimage to Mecca required sophisticated navigation techniques that presupposed a spherical Earth. Pilgrims from distant lands like India, Central Asia, and West Africa calculated their routes using geographic knowledge that assumed the Earth's roundness. The construction of Gothic cathedrals, those towering monuments to medieval engineering, required sophisticated understanding of geometry and mathematics that presupposed knowledge of the Earth's spherical nature. The architects who designed these structures understood the relationship between angles, distances, and the curvature of the Earth. They oriented their buildings precisely and calculated sight lines over vast distances with mathematical precision. That would have been impossible without understanding the Earth's true shape. Even the common people of medieval Europe had practical knowledge that implied understanding of the Earth's spherical nature. Sailors knew that the horizon was curved, that land appeared gradually as they approached it, and that the stars changed position as they traveled north or south. Farmers understood that the sun's path across the sky changed with the seasons, and that these changes were different in different parts of the world. Merchants who traveled long distances knew that the days grew longer or shorter depending on the direction of their journey. The medieval church, far from suppressing knowledge of the Earth's spherical nature, actually promoted it. Church fathers, like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, wrote extensively about the Earth's roundness. They saw no conflict between Christian theology and the understanding of the Earth as a sphere. In fact, they used the Earth's spherical nature as evidence of God's perfect creation. The idea that the Church opposed or suppressed knowledge of the Earth's roundness is a complete fabrication. But if medieval people knew the Earth was round, why do we believe they thought it was flat? The answer lies not in medieval ignorance, but in modern prejudice. The myth of the flat Earth medieval world was created in the 19th century by people who wanted to portray the medieval period as a time of darkness and superstition. This portrayal served their own purposes, allowing them to present their own age as enlightened and progressive by contrast. The question that remains is not whether medieval people knew the Earth was round. They clearly did. The question is how such overwhelming historical evidence came to be so thoroughly ignored, and why this particular myth proved so persistent that it continues to influence popular understanding of the medieval world today. The creation of the TSD flat Earth myth in the 19th century represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. not waged by governments or armies, but by intellectuals and writers who sought to reshape the public's understanding of the past. The story begins not in a medieval monastery or a Renaissance court, but in the drawing rooms and lecture halls of 19th century America and Europe, where a new generation of thinkers was constructing a narrative of human progress that required the medieval period to be portrayed as an age of darkness and ignorance. The architect of this particular myth was Washington Irving, better known today as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. In 1828, Irving published a history of the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus, a work that would prove to be more influential than accurate. Irving was not a historian in the modern sense, he was a storyteller. A man who understood that dramatic narrative was more compelling than dry facts. In his biography of Columbus, Irving created a scene that never occurred. Learned theologians and geographers opposing Columbus's voyage because they believed the earth was flat and feared he would sail off the edge of the world. The scene Irving described was vivid and dramatic. He wrote of Columbus appearing before a council of learned men at the University of Salamanca, where the Sager heads shook disapprovingly at his preposterous plan to sail west to reach the Indies. According to Irving, these medieval scholars argued that the Atlantic was unnavigable and that the Western Ocean was boundless. They supposedly claimed that even if Columbus didn't sail off the edge of the world, he would encounter various monsters and horrid phenomena in the uncharted waters. Irving's account was compelling, but it was also entirely fictional. The real opposition to Columbus came not from flat Earth believers, but from scholars who correctly understood that the Earth was much larger than Columbus calculated. These learned men, who included some of the finest geographers and mathematicians of their time, opposed Columbus's voyage because they knew he had underestimated the distance to Asia by thousands of miles. They feared correctly that he would run out of supplies long before reaching his destination. Their opposition was based on sophisticated geographic knowledge, not primitive superstition. The actual records of Columbus's negotiations with the Spanish court tell a very different story. The royal commission that evaluated Columbus's proposal included men like Hernando de Talavera, Archbishop of Granada, and Diego Deza, a Dominican friar who is also a skilled mathematician. These men understood perfectly well that the Earth was a sphere their libraries contained copies of Ptolemy's geography and other classical works that described the Earth's spherical nature. Their concerns were practical. Columbus's calculations were wrong, and the voyage he proposed was far more dangerous than he claimed. But Irving's fictional account served a purpose that mere historical accuracy could not. It created a clear narrative of progress, with Columbus as the enlightened hero challenging the ignorant prejudices of the medieval world. This narrative appealed to 19th century Americans who saw themselves as the inheritors of Columbus's spirit of discovery and innovation. Irving's book became enormously popular, translated into multiple languages, and read throughout Europe and America. The timing of Irving's work was crucial. The 19th century was a period of rapid scientific and technological advancement, and intellectuals were eager to understand their place in the grand sweep of human history. The theory of evolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the discoveries of modern astronomy all seemed to confirm that humanity was on an upward trajectory from primitive beginnings to enlightened modernity. To make this narrative work, the medieval period had to be portrayed as a time of stagnation and superstition, a dark age from which humanity had only recently emerged. The flat Earth myth fit perfectly into this narrative. It provided a simple, memorable example of medieval ignorance that could be easily contrasted with modern knowledge. The idea that medieval people were too primitive to understand basic geography resonated with audiences who were witnessing the rapid expansion of scientific knowledge in their own time. The myth spread not because it was true, but because it was useful. The myth found particularly fertile ground in Protestant countries, where there was already a tradition of portraying the medieval Catholic Church as an obstacle to human progress. Writers like John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, who were engaged in defending Darwin's theory of evolution against religious opposition, used the flat earth myth as evidence of the Church's historical hostility to scientific truth. Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874, and White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, 1896. Both repeated Irving's fictional account and presented it as historical fact. These works were enormously influential in shaping public opinion. They portrayed the medieval church as an institution that systematically suppressed scientific knowledge and persecuted those who dared to challenge its teachings. The flat earth myth became Exhibit A in this case against medieval Christianity. According to this narrative, brave individuals like Columbus had to struggle against the ignorant prejudices of church-dominated society to advance human knowledge. The irony, of course, is that the medieval church was actually one of the primary preservers and promoters of geographic knowledge. The great medieval scholars who calculated the Earth's circumference, mapped the known world, and developed sophisticated theories of navigation were almost all clergy or worked under church patronage. The universities where this knowledge was taught were church institutions. The libraries where ancient geographic texts were preserved were located in monasteries and cathedrals. But historical accuracy was less important than narrative power. The flat earth myth served multiple purposes for 19th century intellectuals. It justified their own secular worldview by portraying religion as an obstacle to progress. It provided a simple story that anyone could understand and remember. Most importantly, it made their own age seem more enlightened by contrast. The myth was also reinforced by the educational system. Textbooks began to include Irving's fictional account as historical fact. Teachers, many of whom had no specialized training in medieval history, repeated the story to their students. The myth became self-perpetuating as each generation passed it on to the next, often without questioning its accuracy. By the end of the 19th century, the flat earth myth had become so widely accepted that it was rarely questioned. It appeared in encyclopedias, history textbooks, and popular literature. The myth had achieved what all successful myths achieve. It had become more real than reality itself. The actual medieval sources that contradicted it were ignored or dismissed as exceptions to the general rule. The creation of the flat earth myth reveals something important about how historical understanding is constructed. History is not simply a collection of facts about the past. It is a narrative that is constantly being rewritten to serve the needs of the present. The 19th century intellectuals who created the flat earth myth were not deliberately lying about the past. They were constructing a story that made sense of their own experience and justified their own beliefs about progress and enlightenment. The persistence of the myth into the 20th and 21st centuries reveals how difficult it is to correct historical misconceptions once they become widely accepted. Even when presented with overwhelming evidence that medieval people knew the earth was round, many people continue to believe the myth. It has become part of our collective understanding of the past, resistant to correction by mere facts. But the most troubling aspect of the flat earth myth is what it reveals about our own prejudices. The myth persists because it confirms our belief in the superiority of modern knowledge over ancient wisdom. It allows us to feel superior to our ancestors, to dismiss their achievements as primitive superstition. In doing so, we blind ourselves to the remarkable intellectual achievements of the medieval world and impoverish our understanding of human history. The question that emerges from this examination is not just how the flat earth myth was created, but why it proved so durable and what its persistence reveals about our own relationship with the past. The demolition of the flat earth myth requires more than simply pointing out that medieval scholars knew the earth was round. It demands an examination of the overwhelming evidence that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Evidence so abundant and consistent that its rejection represents a collective act of willful blindness. This evidence exists in multiple forms: written texts, architectural achievements, navigational practices, and technological innovations that would have been impossible if their creators believed in a flat Earth. The written evidence alone is staggering in its scope and consistency. The library of the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, founded in the 8th century, contained over 400 manuscripts that referenced the Earth's spherical nature. These were not abstract philosophical treatises, but practical works on astronomy, geography, and navigation that were used by scholars throughout medieval Europe. The catalog of this single library reads like a comprehensive encyclopedia of geographic knowledge. Copies of Ptolemy's Geography, Pliny's Natural History, Macrobius's Commentary on the Dream of Scipio, and dozens of other works that described the Earth as a sphere. The Bodleian Library at Oxford University preserves manuscripts that reveal the sophistication of medieval geographic knowledge. One manuscript, dating from the 12th century, contains detailed calculations of the Earth's circumference that differ from modern measurements by less than 200 miles. Another contains a comprehensive explanation of how lunar eclipses are caused by the Earth's spherical shadow, complete with diagrams showing the relative positions of the Earth, Moon, and Sun. These were not the works of exceptional geniuses, but standard educational texts used in medieval universities. The architectural evidence is equally compelling. The construction of Gothic cathedrals required mathematical and engineering knowledge that presupposed understanding of the Earth's spherical nature. The builders of Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres Cathedral, and countless other medieval structures demonstrated sophisticated understanding of geometry, trigonometry, and celestial mechanics. They oriented their buildings with astronomical precision, calculated sightlines over vast distances, and engineered structures that accounted for the curvature of the Earth. Consider the practical challenges faced by medieval architects. The construction of a cathedral required coordination between multiple work sites, precise calculation of angles and distances, and understanding of how the Earth's curvature affected long-distance measurements. The master builders who directed these projects were not just skilled craftsmen, but applied mathematicians who understood the geometric principles underlying their work. Their achievements would have been impossible without sophisticated knowledge of the Earth's true shape. The navigational evidence is perhaps most convincing of all. Medieval sailors regularly crossed vast expanses of ocean using techniques that required understanding of the Earth's spherical nature. The Vikings who reached North America in the 11th century navigated using sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. They understood that the North Star appeared higher in the sky as they traveled north, that the sun's path changed with latitude, and that the horizon was curved. Their sagas contain detailed descriptions of navigation techniques that presuppose a spherical Earth. The magnetic compass, which became widely used in medieval Europe by the 12th century, was itself evidence of sophisticated understanding of the Earth's magnetic field. Medieval navigators understood that magnetic north was different from true north, and they developed techniques for correcting compass readings based on their location on the Earth's surface. This knowledge required understanding of the Earth as a three-dimensional sphere with a magnetic field, not a flat disk. The technological innovations of the medieval period provide additional evidence of sophisticated geographic knowledge. The development of mechanical clocks in the 13th century required understanding of the Earth's rotation and the relationship between time and geographic location. Medieval clockmakers understood that noon occurred at different times in different locations, and they developed techniques for calculating time differences based on longitude. This knowledge would have been meaningless if they believed the Earth was flat. The cartographic evidence is equally compelling. Medieval maps, properly understood, demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of geography and cartography. The famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300, was not an attempt to show the Earth as flat, but a symbolic representation of the world that combined geographic knowledge with theological symbolism. The mapmaker understood the challenges of representing a spherical Earth on a flat surface and developed conventions for dealing with this problem. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, created by Abraham Cresques for the King of Aragon, demonstrates the height of medieval cartographic achievement. This map shows detailed knowledge of trade routes, political boundaries, and geographic features across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The accuracy of the map in many areas rivals that of modern maps, and its creation required sophisticated Tahitian, mathematical, and astronomical knowledge. The map explicitly shows the Earth as a sphere, with detailed explanations of how different parts of the world experience different seasons and climate conditions. The astronomical evidence is perhaps most decisive. Medieval astronomers routinely calculated eclipses, predicted planetary positions, and developed sophisticated models of celestial mechanics. The Alphonsine tables, compiled in the 13th century under the direction of Alfonso X of Castile, provided accurate predictions of planetary positions for centuries. These calculations required understanding of the Earth's spherical nature and its position in the solar system. The astrolabe, sophisticated astronomical instrument widely used in medieval Europe, was designed specifically for use on a spherical Earth. The instrument contained multiple discs that could be adjusted for different latitudes, and it included detailed instructions for calculating time, direction, and celestial positions based on the user's location on the Earth's surface. The widespread use of astrolabes throughout medieval Europe demonstrates that knowledge of the Earth's spherical nature was not limited to scholarly elites, but was common among educated people throughout society. The evidence from medieval education is equally convincing. The curriculum at medieval universities included detailed study of geography, astronomy, and mathematics. Students learned about the Earth's spherical nature as part of their basic education, and they were expected to understand the practical applications of this knowledge. The surviving lecture notes and textbooks from medieval universities show that the Earth's spherical nature was not a controversial topic, but a basic assumption underlying all geographic and astronomical study. The persistence of the flat Earth myth in the face of such overwhelming evidence reveals something important about the nature of historical understanding. Myths persist not because they are supported by evidence, but because they serve psychological and ideological needs. The flat Earth myth allows modern people to feel superior to their ancestors, to dismiss medieval achievements as primitive superstition, and to construct a narrative of human progress that makes their own age seem more enlightened. But the cost of this myth is enormous. It blinds us to the remarkable intellectual achievements of the medieval world and impoverishes our understanding of human history. It perpetuates the false idea that human progress is linear and inevitable, ignoring the complex ways in which knowledge is created, preserved, and transmitted across generations. Most importantly, it demonstrates how easily historical truth can be displaced by appealing fiction. The flat Utsamoth also reveals the danger of presentism, the tendency to judge the past by the standards of the present. The myth assumes that medieval people were too primitive to understand basic scientific concepts, ignoring the fact that they lived in a world where such knowledge was not only available but actively used in daily life. It reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how knowledge works in human societies, assuming that scientific understanding is somehow natural or inevitable rather than the product of specific historical circumstances. As we confront the weight of evidence against the flat Earth myth, we must ask ourselves what other myths about the past we continue to believe despite contradictory evidence. How many other aspects of our historical understanding are based on convenient fiction rather than careful research? And what does our persistence in believing these myths reveal about our own prejudices and assumptions about the nature of human knowledge and progress? The medieval scholars who calculated the Earth's circumference, mapped the known world, and navigated vast distances across unfamiliar seas were not primitive superstitionists stumbling through a dark age. They were sophisticated intellectuals working within a rich tradition of learning that preserved and extended human knowledge across centuries. Their achievements remind us that wisdom is not the exclusive property of any single age, and that the human capacity for understanding the natural world has deep and ancient roots. The morning of October 16, 1793, dawned gray and cheerless in Paris. As a 37-year-old woman prepared for her final journey, Marie Antoinette, the former Queen of France, would face the guillotine that day, condemned not just for her political associations, but for the collective hatred of a nation that had come to see her, as the symbol of aristocratic excess and callous indifference to the suffering of the poor. Among the charges that had crystallized public opinion against her was the belief that she had once responded to news of bread shortages by suggesting that the starving masses should simply eat cake. This phrase, qu'il mangent de la brioche, had become the defining statement of her reign. The perfect encapsulation of aristocratic detachment from the reality of ordinary people's lives. The irony that would emerge only through historical investigation was that Marie Antoinette had never spoken these words. The phrase that would define her legacy, that would make her name synonymous with callous privilege for centuries to come, was not hers. It was a political weapon forged by others, a convenient fiction that served the revolutionary cause so well that it became more real than reality itself. But to understand how this myth came to dominate our understanding of one of history's most tragic figures, we must first examine the complex reality of Marie Antoinette's life and the circumstances that made her such a perfect target for revolutionary hatred. Marie Antoinette was born Maria Antonia on November 2, 1755. In the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. From birth, she was a political asset, a potential bride whose marriage could cement alliances and secure peace between the great powers of Europe. Her childhood was spent in the glittering but formal world of the Habsburg court, where every moment was governed by elaborate protocol and where personal desires were always subordinated to dynastic necessity. The marriage arrangement that would bring her to France was negotiated when she was still a child. The diplomatic revolution that aligned Austria with France against their common enemy, Prussia, required a symbolic marriage to seal the alliance. Marie Antoinette, then known as the Archduchess Maria Antonia, was selected as the perfect candidate. She was young, beautiful, and politically valuable, the ideal princess to sacrifice on the altar of international diplomacy. Her journey to France in 1770, the age of 14, was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to impress the French people with the magnificence of their future queen. The procession that carried her from Vienna to Versailles was a glittering parade of carriages, attendants, and ceremonial displays that cost the Austrian treasury enormous sums. But this very magnificence, intended to honor France, would later be used as evidence of her extravagance and foreign influence. The young Dauphine arrived at Versailles to find herself in a world even more rigid and ceremonial than the one she had left. The French court was a Byzantine maze of protocol, precedents, and political intrigue where every gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning. She was expected to produce an heir to secure the succession to represent French interests while maintaining her loyalty to Austria and to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics without making enemies. It was a nearly impossible task for a teenager who had been raised in a different culture with different expectations. The early years of her marriage were marked by personal difficulties that would have profound political consequences. Her husband, the future Louis XVI, was awkward, shy, and apparently uninterested in physical intimacy. The couple's failure to produce an heir became a source of public speculation and political concern. In a monarchy where the Queen's primary function was to provide succession, Marie Antoinette's inability to become pregnant was seen as both a personal failure and a political crisis. The pressure on the young queen was immense. Every aspect of her life was subject to public scrutiny and criticism. Her Austrian origins made her suspect in the eyes of many French nobles who saw her as a foreign agent. Her youthful attempts to find some measure of happiness and freedom in the oppressive atmosphere of Versailles were interpreted as evidence of frivolity and moral corruption. The gambling, dancing, and fashion that were normal activities for a young woman of her class were transformed into symbols of decadence and excess, the birth of her first child. Marie-Thérèse, in 1778, should have silenced her critics and secured her position. Instead, it seemed to intensify the attacks on her character. The same people who had criticized her for failing to produce an heir now criticized her for her devotion to her children. Her desire to raise her children in a more natural environment, away from the suffocating protocol of Versailles, was seen as evidence of her foreign influences and her rejection of French traditions. The economic crisis that would ultimately lead to the French Revolution was already visible in the 1780s. France was heavily in debt from its involvement in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. The government's attempts to address the fiscal crisis through new taxes and economic reforms were met with resistance from the nobility and the parliaments. In this atmosphere of economic uncertainty and political tension, Marie Antoinette became a convenient scapegoat for the kingdom's problems. The pamphlet literature that flourished in the years before the Revolution transformed Marie Antoinette from a person into a symbol. The underground press, much of it financed by political enemies of the monarchy, produced an endless stream of pornographic and political attacks on the Queen. These pamphlets, known as libels, portrayed her as sexually promiscuous, politically treacherous, and morally corrupt. They accused her of conducting affairs with various court figures, of sending state secrets to Austria, and of manipulating her weak husband for her own purposes. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 provided the perfect scandal to crystallize public opinion against the Queen. Although she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, the complex fraud involving a cardinal, a courtesan, and a diamond necklace worth 1.6 million livres was widely believed to demonstrate her greed and corruption. The fact that she had actually refused to purchase the necklace, believing it too expensive for a time of economic hardship, was lost in the public perception that she was somehow responsible for the scandal. The reality of Marie Antoinette's life was far more complex than the caricature that developed around her. She was indeed privileged and wealthy, but she was also trapped in a system that allowed her little real freedom or power. Her attempts to create a more private life for herself and her family were constantly frustrated by the demands of court, protocol, and public expectations. Her genuine concerns about the suffering of the poor were overshadowed by the symbolic role she had been forced to play. The charitable work that occupied much of her time was rarely mentioned in the hostile pamphlets and popular songs that circulated about her. She patronized numerous charitable institutions, provided dowries for poor girls, and supported widows and orphans. During the harsh winter of 1788 to 1789, she donated large sums to relief efforts and personally distributed food to the hungry. But these acts of charity, performed quietly and without fanfare, could not compete with the dramatic stories of excess and indifference that her enemies promoted. The Queen's personal correspondence, much of which survived the Revolution, reveals a woman who is deeply concerned about the suffering of the French people and frustrated by her inability to help them more effectively. Her letters to her brother, Emperor Joseph II, and her friends in Austria show her growing awareness of the political crisis facing France and her desperate attempts to find solutions. She was not the callous, indifferent aristocrat of revolutionary propaganda, but a woman caught between competing loyalties and impossible expectations. As the revolution approached, Marie Antoinette found herself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The same qualities that had made her a suitable bride for the Dauphin her foreign birth, her youth, her beauty now, made her a perfect target for revolutionary hatred. She represented everything that the revolutionaries claimed to oppose: aristocratic privilege, foreign influence, and royal excess. The fact that she had never actually exhibited the callous indifference attributed to her was irrelevant to the political purposes she served. The phrase "let them eat cake" would not emerge until the revolution was well underway. But the groundwork for its acceptance was being laid in these earlier years. The image of Marie Antoinette as a frivolous, extravagant queen who cared nothing for the suffering of her subjects was carefully constructed through years of propaganda and political manipulation. When the famous phrase was finally attributed to her, it seemed to confirm what people already believed about her character. But the woman who had faced the guillotine in 1793 was not the caricature of revolutionary propaganda. She was a complex individual who had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances and who had struggled to find her place in a world that offered her little real choice or freedom. The tragedy of her life was not just her violent death, but the way her real humanity was obscured by the political mythology that surrounded her. The question that haunts her story is not whether she was a perfect queen or a flawed human being, but whether the mythological version of her life serves any purpose other than to comfort us with the illusion that complex political and social problems can be reduced to simple moral categories. The phrase "she never spoke" continues to define her legacy, but what does its persistence reveal about our own relationship with historical truth and the stories we tell ourselves about the past? The origins of "let them eat cake" lead us not to the gilded halls of Versailles, but to the study of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the brilliant and troubled philosopher whose ideas would help shape the French Revolution. In 1766, 23 years before the Revolution began, and when Marie Antoinette was just 11 years old, Rousseau was working on his autobiographical masterpiece, Confessions. In this deeply personal work, he recounted a story that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. Rousseau wrote about a moment in his youth when he was hungry and had no money to buy bread. He remembered someone telling him about a great princess who, upon hearing that the people had no bread, had suggested they eat la croûte de piti, the crust of piti. In some versions of the story, this became brioche, a rich, egg-enriched bread that was more expensive than ordinary bread. The identity of this great princess was never specified by Rousseau, but the story served his purpose as an example of aristocratic ignorance about the lives of common people. The phrase "Rousseau" recorded was not original even in his time. Variations of it had been circulating in different forms for decades, attributed to various royal figures. The Spanish princess Marie Therese, who had married Louis XIV in 1660, had been accused of making a similar statement about the French people eating la croûte de piti. The phrase seemed to be a floating accusation, a convenient way to express the popular belief that the aristocracy was out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. The story's appeal lay not in its historical accuracy, but in its dramatic power. It perfectly captured the perceived relationship between the rulers and the ruled, between the pampered elite and the suffering masses. The phrase had a crystalline quality that made it easy to remember and repeat. It reduced complex economic and political problems to a simple moral statement: the rich don't understand the poor. This simplicity made it a perfect tool for political criticism, even when, or perhaps especially when, it was not true. The transformation of this wandering phrase into a specific accusation against Marie Antoinette required the perfect storm of political circumstances that emerged in the 1780s and 1790s. The French monarchy was facing its deepest crisis in centuries, with massive debt, economic stagnation, and growing popular unrest. The traditional system of royal authority was breaking down, and new forms of political communication were emerging. That would fundamentally change the relationship between rulers and subjects. The pamphlet literature that flourished in pre-revolutionary France created a new form of political discourse. These small, cheaply printed publications could be produced quickly and distributed widely, reaching audiences that had never before had access to political commentary. The authors of these pamphlets, many of them working anonymously, were skilled at creating memorable phrases and dramatic stories that would stick in readers' minds. They understood that political truth was less important than political effectiveness. Marie Antoinette was a perfect target for this new form of political attack. Her foreign origins, her youth, her beauty, and her association with the unpopular Austrian alliance made her an ideal focus for popular resentment. The pamphlet writers transformed her into a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy: foreign influence, aristocratic excess, and indifference to the suffering of the people. The "let them eat cake" phrase, whether or not it was initially attributed to her, fit perfectly into this constructed image. The revolutionary press, which emerged after 1789, took these techniques and applied them on a massive scale. Newspapers like Jean-Paul Marat's L'Ami du Peuple and Jacques Hébert's Le Père Duchesne reached audiences throughout France with inflammatory stories about the royal family. These publications were not bound by modern standards of journalistic accuracy. Their purpose was to mobilize public opinion, not to report facts. The repetition of accusations, regardless of their truth, was seen as a legitimate political tactic. The attribution of the "let them eat cake" phrase to Marie Antoinette appears to have emerged gradually during the revolutionary period. It was not a single dramatic moment when someone claimed she had said it, but a slow accumulation of references and repetitions that eventually crystallized into accepted fact. The phrase was too useful, too perfect a symbol of aristocratic callousness, to be abandoned simply because it was not true. The political context of the revolution made the phrase particularly powerful. France was experiencing severe food shortages, and bread riots were common in Paris and other cities. The price of bread was a constant concern for ordinary people, and the government's inability to ensure adequate food supplies was seen as evidence of its incompetence and indifference. In this atmosphere, a story about a queen suggesting that hungry people eat expensive cake instead of bread seemed to capture the essence of royal insensitivity. The phrase also fit into the revolutionary narrative about the nature of aristocratic society. The revolutionaries argued that the old regime was not just politically oppressive, but morally corrupt. The aristocracy, they claimed, was so removed from the reality of ordinary life that they literally did not understand how common people lived. The "let them eat cake" story provided perfect evidence for this argument, demonstrating that the queen was not just politically hostile to the people, but completely ignorant of their basic needs. The international dimension of the story added another layer of meaning. Marie Antoinette's Austrian origins made her suspect to French patriots who saw the revolution as a struggle against foreign influence. The story of her callous response to French suffering seemed to confirm that she was more concerned with her foreign family than with her adopted country. The phrase became evidence not just of aristocratic indifference, but of foreign treachery. The story's power was enhanced by its apparent authenticity. Unlike obviously fabricated stories about the queen's sexual adventures or political conspiracies, the "let them eat cake" incident seemed like the kind of thing that could actually have happened. It was plausible in a way that made it difficult to refute. People who might have questioned more dramatic accusations could easily believe that a pampered queen might have made such an ignorant statement. The phrase also had a linguistic quality that made it particularly memorable. The French Kiel Mangent de la brioche has a rhythmic quality that makes it easy to remember and repeat. When translated into English as "let them eat cake," it becomes even more concise and punchy. The phrase had the quality of a slogan or a motto, something that could be easily quoted and requoted without losing its impact. The story's persistence through the Revolutionary period was ensured by its usefulness to different political factions. The moderate revolutionaries used it to demonstrate the need for political reform, while the radical revolutionaries used it to justify more extreme measures. The phrase was equally useful to those who wanted to reform the monarchy and those who wanted to destroy it entirely. Its ambiguity was a strength, allowing different groups to interpret it in ways that supported their own political goals. The international spread of the story was facilitated by the widespread interest in the French Revolution throughout Europe and America. Foreign observers, many of whom were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause, repeated the story in their own countries. The phrase became part of the international understanding of the French Revolution, a symbol of the oppression that had made the revolution necessary. The story's survival beyond the revolutionary period required its transformation from a political weapon into a historical fact. The historians who wrote about the French Revolution in the 19th century, many of whom were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause, accepted the story as true and included it in their accounts. The phrase became part of the standard historical narrative about Marie Antoinette and the causes of the French Revolution. The persistence of the story reveals something important about the nature of historical truth. Once a story becomes embedded in the historical record, it becomes very difficult to dislodge, even when evidence emerges that contradicts it. The "let them eat cake" phrase had become so associated with Marie Antoinette that it seemed to define her character. Historians who questioned its accuracy were seen as defending the old regime or minimizing the suffering of the French people. The story's modern persistence reflects our continued need for simple explanations of complex historical events. The French Revolution was an enormously complicated phenomenon, with economic, political, social, and cultural dimensions that resist easy explanation. The "let them eat cake" story provides a simple moral framework that makes the revolution easier to understand and remember. It reduces the complex causes of the revolution to a simple story of good versus evil, of compassionate revolutionaries versus callous aristocrats. But the cost of this simplification is enormous. It obscures the real complexity of the revolutionary period and the genuine tragedy of Marie Antoinette's life. It transforms a complex political and social crisis into a simple moral tale that tells us more about our own prejudices than about the historical reality of 18th century France. The phrase that was never spoken continues to shape our understanding of one of history's most important events. But what does its persistence reveal about our own relationship with historical truth? The execution of Marie Antoinette on October 16, 1793, marked not just the end of a life, but the triumph of a carefully constructed mythology over historical reality. As the blade fell in the place de la Revolution, it severed not merely the head of a 37-year-old woman, but the last connection between the real Marie Antoinette and the symbolic figure she had become. The woman who died that day was not the callous aristocrat of revolutionary propaganda, but a complex individual whose humanity had been systematically erased by the political necessities of her time. The final months of Marie Antoinette's life, spent in the conciergerie prison, revealed the vast gulf between the mythological queen and the actual woman. The prison records, maintained with bureaucratic precision by her jailers, document the daily routine of a woman who had been stripped of all the trappings of royalty. She woke before dawn, attended Mass when permitted, and spent her days in a damp, poorly lit cell that measured barely 8 by 10 feet. Her meals consisted of simple fare, bread, soup, and occasional vegetables. The woman who was supposed to have callously suggested that the hungry should eat cake was herself subsisting on the most basic prison rations. The correspondence that Marie Antoinette was permitted to write during her imprisonment provides, perhaps, the most powerful evidence against the let them eat cake myth. Her letters to her family and friends reveal a woman who was deeply aware of the suffering of the French people and who blamed herself for her inability to help them. She wrote to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, about her guilt over the bloodshed of the Revolution. "I am free of hatred toward those who have condemned us. I hope that God will forgive them." These were not the words of a woman who had ever been indifferent to the suffering of others. The testimonies of those who knew her personally, both supporters and critics, consistently contradict the image of callous indifference that had been constructed around her. Even Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror who would ultimately order her execution, acknowledged in private conversations that Marie Antoinette had been personally generous to the poor. The revolutionary prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, who presented the case against her at her trial, later admitted that many of the charges against her had been fabricated for political purposes. The economic records of her household provide concrete evidence of her charitable activities. The accounts of the royal household show that Marie Antoinette regularly donated large sums to charity, often giving away money that had been allocated for her personal use. During the harsh winter of 1788 to 1789, she gave 200,000 livres to relief, efforts an enormous sum that represented a significant portion of her personal allowance. The detailed records of these donations, preserved in the French National Archives, paint a picture of a woman who is genuinely concerned about the welfare of the poor. The medical records from her imprisonment reveal the physical toll that her ordeal had taken. The royal physician who was permitted to examine her in her final weeks reported that she was suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic illness, and what would today be recognized as symptoms of severe depression. The woman, who had once been celebrated for her beauty, was described by witnesses as prematurely aged, her hair white, her face gaunt. The psychological torture of her imprisonment, combined with the grief of losing her husband and the fear for her children's safety, had transformed her into a shadow of her former self. The trial that condemned her to death was a judicial mockery that revealed the extent to which political mythology had triumphed over legal reality. The charges against her included treason, correspondence with foreign enemies, and corrupting her husband, but notably, they did not include the specific accusation of saying, "Let them eat cake." The prosecutors, despite their eagerness to present evidence of her callousness, apparently could not find sufficient evidence to support this particular charge. The phrase that had done so much to shape public opinion against her was too useful as propaganda to be subjected to the scrutiny of a courtroom. The international reaction to her execution revealed the extent to which the myth had spread beyond France. European newspapers reported her death with varying degrees of sympathy, but most repeated the let them eat cake story as established fact. The phrase had become so associated with her that it seemed to explain and justify her execution. Foreign observers who had never met her, and who had no direct knowledge of her actions, accepted the story as proof of her character. The impact of her execution on her surviving family demonstrates the human cost of political mythology. Her daughter Marie Therese, who had witnessed the destruction of her family, spent the rest of her life trying to rehabilitate her mother's reputation. Her memoirs, written decades after the Revolution, provide a first-hand account of Marie Antoinette's character that directly contradicts the revolutionary propaganda. But these personal testimonies, no matter how credible, could not compete with the dramatic power of the let them eat cake myth. The psychological impact of the myth on those who knew her was profound. The servants, courtiers, and friends who had witnessed her actual behavior were forced to watch as the woman they knew was transformed into a symbol of everything they abhorred. Some of them, like Madame de Polignac and the Duchesse de Lamballe, suffered exile, imprisonment, or or death simply for their association with her. Others, like the Abbé Edgeworth Deferment, who attended her execution, spent the rest of their lives trying to correct the historical record. The broader social impact of the myth extended far beyond the immediate victims. The let them eat cake story became part of the revolutionary narrative that justified the violence of the terror. If the queen could be so callous about the suffering of the people, then perhaps the extreme measures taken against her and her family were justified. The myth provided moral cover for actions that might otherwise have been difficult to justify. Transforming judicial murder into righteous justice. The historical consequences of the myth extended well beyond the Revolutionary period. The story became embedded in the historical record, influencing how subsequent generations understood the causes of the French Revolution. Historians who accepted the story as fact used it to explain the intensity of popular hatred toward the monarchy. The myth became part of the causal chain that led from aristocratic indifference to revolutionary violence, providing a moral framework for understanding one of history's most important events. The persistence of the myth into the modern era reveals our continued need for simple explanations of complex historical events. The French Revolution was the result of numerous factors: economic crisis, social inequality, political corruption, intellectual ferment, and international conflict. But the Let Them Eat Cake story provides a digestible narrative that reduces this complexity to a simple moral tale. It allows us to understand the revolution as a straightforward conflict between good and evil, between compassionate revolutionaries and callous aristocrats. The modern rehabilitation of Marie Antoinette's reputation, based on careful historical research, has revealed the extent to which the myth distorted our understanding of her character. The scholarly work of historians like Antonia Fraser and Evelyn Lever has documented her charitable activities, her genuine concern for the French people, and her desperate attempts to prevent the slide toward revolution. But this academic correction of the historical record has had little impact on popular understanding of her character. The persistence of the myth in popular culture and films, novels, and casual references demonstrates the power of dramatic fiction over historical truth. The Let Them Eat Cake story is simply too good a story to abandon, too perfect a symbol of aristocratic callousness to be discarded in favor of more complex historical reality. It provides a clear moral framework that makes the past easier to understand and remember, even when that framework is based on fiction rather than fact. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette's legacy is not just that she was falsely accused of saying something she never said, but that this false accusation has obscured the real tragedy of her life. She was a woman who was caught between competing loyalties and impossible expectations. She tried to find happiness and meaning in a world that offered her little real choice or freedom. Her story is not the simple tale of aristocratic callousness that the myth suggests, but a complex human drama that reveals the costs of political upheaval and the vulnerability of individuals caught in the machinery of historical change. The question that her story raises is not whether she was a perfect queen or a flawed human being, but whether our continued acceptance of the myth serves any purpose other than to comfort us with the illusion that complex political and social problems can be reduced to simple moral categories. The phrase "she never spoke" continues to define her legacy, but what does its persistence reveal about our own relationship with historical truth and the stories we tell ourselves about the past? In the mists of a Danish bog, on a cold morning in 1942, two peat harvesters made a discovery that would fundamentally challenge one of history's most enduring images. As they worked the sodden earth near the village of Vix, their shovels struck something hard and metallic. What they unearthed were two bronze helmets, magnificent in their craftsmanship, adorned with curved horns that gleamed despite their centuries in the bog. The discoverers, like countless others before and after them, immediately assumed they had found authentic Viking artifacts' physical proof Of the horned helmets that had adorned the heads of Norse warriors in popular imagination for generations, the helmets were indeed spectacular. Each was crafted from thin sheets of bronze, decorated with intricate circular patterns and symbols that spoke of skilled metalworkers and a sophisticated culture. The horns themselves were not mere decorative additions, but integral parts of the design, carefully shaped and attached to create an imposing silhouette. The craftsmanship was so fine that the helmets must have taken weeks to complete, representing not just artistic skill, but significant economic investment. These were clearly ceremonial objects, created for someone of great importance. But as archaeologists began to study the Vix helmets more carefully, disturbing questions emerged. The style of decoration seemed wrong for the Viking Age. The bronze working techniques appeared to be much older than expected. Most troubling of all, radiocarbon dating of organic materials found with the helmets suggested they were far older than any known Viking artifacts. The helmets that had seemed to confirm the popular image of horned Vikings were actually challenging the very foundations of that image. The dating results, when they finally came back from the laboratory, were shocking. The helmets were not from the Viking Age at all, but from around 900 BC, in nearly 2,000 years before the Viking period began. They belonged to the Nordic Bronze Age, a time when the ancestors of the Vikings were still developing the cultural and technological foundations that would eventually give rise to the seafaring warriors of the early medieval period. The horned helmets that had seemed to authenticate the popular image of Vikings were actually proof that this image was wrong. The discovery of the Vix helmets opened a window into a much deeper and more complex story about the origins of one of history's most persistent myths. The horned helmet had become so associated with Vikings in popular culture that it seemed impossible to imagine Norse warriors without them. Children's books, movies, operas, and countless other cultural products had embedded the image so deeply in collective consciousness that it had become more real than reality itself. But the archaeological evidence was clear. Vikings had never worn horned helmets. The actual Viking Age, which lasted roughly from 793 to 1066 CE, began with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in England and ended with the defeat of Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. During this period, Norse warriors spread across Europe, establishing settlements in England, Ireland, France, Russia, and even reaching North America. They were skilled sailors, traders, and warriors who left behind a rich archaeological record that includes weapons, jewelry, tools, and artwork. But in all of this vast archaeological evidence, not a single horned helmet has ever been found. The helmets that Vikings actually wore were practical, functional pieces of equipment designed for warfare, not ceremony. A few surviving examples, such as the German Boo helmet found in Norway, are simple, conical caps made of iron plates riveted together. They protected the head and face without unnecessary ornamentation that might catch weapons or create weak points. Some had nose guards or eye protection, but none had horns. The Vikings were practical warriors who understood that a helmet's primary function was protection, not intimidation. The archaeological evidence from Viking burials consistently supports this picture of practical, unadorned helmets. The graves of wealthy Viking warriors, who could afford the best equipment available, contain simple iron helmets without any trace of horns. The sagas and other literary sources from the Viking period describe warriors' equipment in detail. But they never mention horned helmets. The skaldic poetry that celebrated Viking warriors focuses on their courage, skill, and weapons, but makes no reference to distinctive headgear. The contrast between the archaeological evidence and the popular image of Vikings reveals the power of cultural mythology to override historical fact. The horned helmet had become such a fundamental part of the Viking image that people literally could not see Vikings without them. Museum displays, history textbooks, and popular culture all reinforced the myth. creating a self-perpetuating cycle of misinformation that became increasingly difficult to correct. The origins of the horned helmet myth lay not in Viking Age Scandinavia, but in the romantic nationalism of 19th-century Europe. As nations across Europe sought to construct heroic narratives about their past, the Vikings became symbols of primitive strength and martial valor. The horned helmet, borrowed from much older Bronze Age imagery, provided a dramatic visual element that made these ancient warriors seem more exotic and impressive. The myth was not an accident of historical transmission, but a deliberate construction designed to serve the cultural needs of a later age. The Bronze Age cultures that actually created horned helmets were themselves fascinating societies that have been overshadowed by the Viking myth. The Nordic Bronze Age, which lasted from about 1700 to 500 BCE, was a time of remarkable cultural achievement. These societies developed sophisticated metallurgy, created elaborate rock art, and established extensive trade networks that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean. The horned helmets found at Vix were just one example of their artistic and technological achievements. The actual function of these Bronze Age horned helmets remains a matter of scholarly debate. They were clearly ceremonial objects, too delicate and impractical for actual warfare. Some scholars suggest they were worn by priests or shamans in religious ceremonies. Others propose they were symbols of rank or status, worn by chieftains or kings on special occasions. The horns themselves may have been symbolic, representing the power of wild animals or the connection between the human and divine realms. The discovery of similar discral horned helmets and horned figures in rock art throughout Bronze Age Europe suggests that the horn motif had widespread religious or cultural significance. The horned figures depicted in Bronze Age art are often shown in contexts that suggest religious or ritual activity. They appear to be dancing, fighting, or participating in ceremonies that may have been central to Bronze Age religious practice. The horns may have been symbols of divine power or magical potency. The trade networks that brought the horned helmet tradition to Scandinavia were themselves remarkable achievements of Bronze Age civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that the horn motif originated in the ancient Near East, where horned helmets appear in Mesopotamian art as early as 3000 BCE. The motif spread westward through Mediterranean trade routes, eventually reaching the Atlantic shores of Europe. The Phoenicians, those master traders of the ancient world, may have been instrumental in spreading the imagery that would eventually inspire the Bronze Age. Craftsmen of Scandinavia. The sophisticated metallurgy required to create the Vix helmets demonstrates the high level of technological achievement in Bronze Age Scandinavia. The thin bronze sheets had to be carefully shaped and joined. The decorative patterns required precise tool work, and the horns had to be carefully formed and attached. The bronze itself was an alloy of copper and tin that had to be carefully balanced to achieve the right properties. The tin, in particular, was a rare and valuable material that had to be imported from distant sources. The preservation of the Vix helmets in the Danish bog was itself a remarkable stroke of luck. The anaerobic conditions of the bog prevented oxidation and decay, preserving not just the bronze, but also organic materials that would normally have disappeared long ago. The birch tar used to attach the horns provided the organic material that made radiocarbon dating possible. Without this preservation, the helmets might have been lost forever, and the myth of Viking horned helmets might have continued unchallenged. The careful excavation and study of the Vix helmets exemplifies the power of modern archaeology to correct historical misconceptions. The techniques used to date and analyze the helmet's radiocarbon dating, metallurgical analysis, and comparative stylistic study were not available to earlier generations of scholars. These scientific methods allowed archaeologists to see past the cultural assumptions that had shaped earlier interpretations of the artifacts. The story of the Vix helmets also reveals the complex relationship between popular culture and historical scholarship. The initial assumption that the helmets were Viking artifacts was not based on careful analysis, but on cultural expectations about what Viking artifacts should look like. The helmets fit so perfectly into the popular image of Vikings that their true age and origin were initially overlooked. Only when scholars began to question these assumptions did the real story emerge: the persistence of the horned helmet myth in popular culture. Despite the clear archaeological evidence against it, demonstrates the power of cultural images to resist factual correction. The myth serves psychological and cultural needs that mere historical accuracy cannot satisfy. It provides a dramatic visual symbol that makes the Vikings seem more exotic and impressive than they would appear in simple iron helmets. The myth transforms practical warriors into legendary figures, ordinary soldiers into mythical heroes. But the cost of this mythologizing is enormous. It obscures the real achievements of both Viking Age and Bronze Age cultures, reducing complex historical societies to simple stereotypes. It perpetuates the idea that the past is somehow more dramatic and exotic than the present, preventing us from understanding the real human dimensions of historical experience. Most importantly, it demonstrates how easily cultural mythology can triumph over historical evidence, creating facts that become more real than reality itself. The question that emerges from the story of the Vik's helmets is not just whether Vikings wore horned helmets, but why this particular myth proved so durable and what its persistence reveals about our relationship with the past. The warriors who sailed from Scandinavia to raid and settle across Europe were remarkable enough without fictional embellishments. Their real achievements, their navigational skills, their adaptability, their impact on European history are far more impressive than any mythical horned helmet could make them. But somehow, the myth has proven more appealing than the reality, more memorable than the truth. The transformation of the horned helmet from a Bronze Age religious artifact to a Viking warrior's headgear is one of history's most successful cases of cultural appropriation, but it was not an accident of historical transmission. It was a deliberate creation of 19th century European nationalism, romanticism, and theatrical innovation. The process by which this ancient symbol became attached to the Vikings reveals how historical myths are constructed and why they prove so resistant to correction. The story begins not in medieval Scandinavia, but in the salons and opera houses of 19th century Europe, where a new fascination with the Germanic past was emerging. The Romantic movement, with its emphasis on emotion, individualism, and the sublime power of nature, found in the Vikings perfect symbols of primitive strength and freedom. These ancient warriors represented everything that modern industrialized Europe seemed to have lost: direct connection to nature, uncomplicated heroism, and the ability to shape one's destiny through individual will and courage. The scholarly foundation for this romantic vision was provided by the rediscovery of medieval Scandinavian literature. The poetic Edda, the prose Edda, and the Icelandic sagas were being translated into modern European languages for the first time, revealing a rich world of myth, legend, and heroic adventure. These texts presented the Vikings not as the brutal raiders of medieval chronicles, but as complex figures living in a world of gods, heroes, and cosmic struggle. The literary Vikings were poets as well as warriors, explorers as well as conquerors. The visual representation of these literary Vikings presented a significant challenge. The medieval texts provided detailed descriptions of weapons, clothing, and customs, but they said remarkably little about helmets. The archaeological evidence was even less helpful, since few Viking helmets had been discovered, and those that had been found were disappointingly simple. The artistic challenge was to create a visual image that would capture the exotic, heroic nature of the Vikings while making them immediately recognizable to modern audiences. The solution came from the world of opera, where visual spectacle was as important as musical performance. The composer Richard Wagner, working on his monumental Ring of the Nibelung cycle in the 1850s and 1860s, needed costumes that would make his Germanic heroes appear both ancient and impressive. Wagner's costume designers, drawing on a mixture of archaeological evidence and artistic imagination, created the distinctive look that would define the Viking image for generations to come. The key figure in this transformation was Carl Emil Doppler, a German artist who designed the costumes for the first production of Wagner's Ring cycle. Doppler was faced with the challenge of creating visually striking costumes that would convey the primitive power of the Germanic heroes while remaining practical for operatic performance. His solution was to combine elements from different periods of Germanic history, creating a composite image that was historically inaccurate but dramatically effective. For the helmet designs, Doppler turned to the Bronze Age artifacts that were being discovered throughout Northern Europe. The horned helmets of the Bronze Age seemed to perfectly capture the primitive, mysterious nature of the Germanic past. They were exotic enough to seem ancient, distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable, and dramatic enough to work effectively on stage. The fact that these helmets predated the Vikings by nearly 2,000 years was irrelevant, too. Doppler's theatrical purposes, the success of Wagner's Ring cycle ensured that Doppler's costume designs would have enormous influence on popular culture. The operas were performed throughout Europe and America, creating a standard visual vocabulary for representing the Germanic past. The horned helmet became so associated with Wagner's heroes that it seemed impossible to imagine them without it. Other opera composers, playwrights, and artists adopted the same visual conventions, reinforcing the association between horned helmets and Germanic warriors. The influence of Wagner's operas extended far beyond the theater. The composer's works were seen as authentic representations of Germanic mythology, and his visual style was adopted by historians, archaeologists, and popular writers. The horned helmet began to appear in history books, museum displays, and scholarly articles about the Vikings. What had begun as a theatrical convention gradually became accepted as historical fact. The timing of this transformation was crucial. The 19th century was a period of intense nationalism throughout Europe, and different nations were competing to construct heroic narratives about their past. The Germans, seeking to establish their cultural credentials against the French and English, embraced the Vikings as symbols of Germanic strength and independence. The horned helmet became a visual symbol of this Germanic identity, a way of connecting modern Germans with their supposedly heroic ancestors. The archaeological discoveries of the 19th century seem to support the horned helmet myth. The Bronze Age helmets found at Vix and other sites were initially interpreted as Viking artifacts, confirming what people already believed about Germanic warriors. The scholars who studied these artifacts were influenced by the cultural expectations of their time, seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. The scientific methods that would eventually expose the true age of these helmets were not yet available. The myth was further reinforced by the popular literature of the 19th century. Writers like Thomas Gray, with his poem, The Fatal Sisters, and later authors like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, with the saga of King Olaf, created vivid literary images of Vikings that incorporated the horned helmet. These works were widely read and helped establish the horned helmet as a standard element of Viking imagery in popular culture. The emergence of archaeology as a scientific discipline in the 19th century might have been expected to correct the horned helmet myth, but initially it had the opposite effect. The early archaeologists, influenced by the cultural assumptions of their time, interpreted their discoveries in ways that confirmed existing beliefs about the Vikings. The few actual Viking helmets that were discovered were seen as exceptions to the general rule, unusual examples of practical military gear rather than representative artifacts. The influence of Germanic nationalism on archaeological interpretation was particularly strong in Germany and Scandinavia. where scholars were eager to demonstrate the cultural achievements of their ancestors. The horned helmet became a symbol of Germanic artistic and technological achievement, evidence of the sophisticated culture that had produced the Vikings. The myth served nationalist purposes that made objective analysis difficult. The spread of the horned helmet myth was accelerated by the new technologies of mass communication that emerged in the 19th century. Illustrated magazines, mass-produced books, and later cinema brought the image of horned Vikings to audiences throughout the world. The visual impact of the horned helmet made it an ideal symbol for mass media, instantly recognizable and dramatically effective. The influence of children's literature was particularly important in establishing the horned helmet myth. Books like The Story of the Vikings by E. Boyd Smith and countless other children's histories presented the horned helmet as an established fact. Children who grew up with these images carried them into adulthood, passing them on to their own children. The myth became self-perpetuating, maintained by educational systems that accepted it as historical truth. The development of the historical novel as a literary genre also contributed to the spread of the myth. Writers like Sir Walter Scott and later authors who wrote about the Viking period incorporated the horned helmet into their narratives, giving it the authority of historical fiction. These novels were often more influential than scholarly works in shaping popular understanding of the Viking period. The emergence of tourism in the 19th century created new pressures to maintain the horned helmet myth. Scandinavian countries began to market their Viking heritage as a tourist attraction, and the horned helmet became a crucial element of this marketing. Museums, historical sites, and tourist attractions all featured horned Vikings, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the myth while making it economically valuable. The influence of political movements on the horned helmet myth cannot be underestimated. The Germanic nationalism of the 19th century gave way to more extreme forms of nationalism in the 20th century, and the horned helmet became a symbol of Nordic racial superiority. The myth was appropriated by political movements that used it to support ideologies of Germanic supremacy, adding political dimensions to what had begun as a theatrical convention. The persistence of the horned helmet myth into the 20th century demonstrates the power of visual imagery to override factual evidence. Even as archaeological techniques improved and the true age of the Bronze Age helmets became clear, the myth continued to flourish in popular culture. The horned helmet had become so associated with Vikings that people literally could not imagine them without it. The story of how the horned helmet became attached to the Vikings reveals the complex process by which historical myths are created and maintained. It shows how cultural needs, artistic conventions, and political purposes can combine to create facts that become more real than reality itself. The myth was not simply a mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate construction that served specific cultural purposes. The question that emerges from this story is not just how the myth was created, but why it proved so durable and what its persistence reveals about our relationship with the past. The Vikings, who actually lived in medieval Scandinavia, were remarkable enough without fictional embellishments, but somehow the myth has proven more appealing than the reality. The horned helmet continues to define the Viking image in popular culture. But what does this tell us about our need for exotic, dramatic symbols of the past? The archaeological excavation of a Viking warrior's grave in Germanbu, Norway, in 1943 provided a stark contrast to the popular image of horned Vikings. The burial, dating to the 10th century, contained the remains of a wealthy warrior, along with his weapons, tools, and personal possessions. Among these artifacts was a helmet, not the ornate, horned headgear of popular imagination, but a simple, practical piece of military equipment that revealed the true nature of Viking warfare and the culture that produced it. The German Boo helmet, as it came to be known, was constructed from 4 triangular iron plates riveted together to form a cap that covered the top and sides of the head. A simple nose guard protected the face, and a chainmail coif would have covered the neck and shoulders. The helmet was functional, efficient, and utterly devoid of ornamental horns. It was designed by warriors for warriors, prioritizing protection. Over appearance, practicality over drama. This single artifact, carefully excavated and studied by archaeologists, has provided more reliable information about Viking military equipment than centuries of speculation and artistic imagination. The helmet's construction revealed sophisticated metalworking techniques. Its design showed deep understanding of combat requirements. And its presence in a wealthy warrior's grave demonstrated the value placed on head protection in Viking society. But it also revealed how far the popular image of Vikings had diverged from historical reality. The rarity of surviving Viking helmets reflects both the practical realities of medieval warfare and the economic constraints of Viking society. Helmets were expensive to produce, requiring skilled metalworkers and valuable iron. They were also valuable enough to be passed down through families, reused by successive generations, or melted down for other purposes. The fact that so few have survived does not mean they were uncommon, but rather that they were too valuable to be casually discarded. The documentary evidence from the Viking period consistently supports the archaeological picture of simple, practical helmets. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century, but preserving much earlier oral traditions, describe warriors' equipment in considerable detail. They mention helmets frequently, but always in terms of their protective function rather than their ornamental value. The sagas speak of helmets being bright or strong, but never of them being horned. The skaldic poetry composed by Viking court poets provides another source of evidence about warrior equipment. These poems, which were composed for immediate performance before audiences that included warriors, describe military equipment with professional accuracy. The poets mention helmets, shields, swords, and spears, but their descriptions focus on practical military effectiveness rather than decorative features. The absence of any reference to horned helmets in this extensive poetic literature is particularly significant. The economic evidence from Viking Age, Scandinavia helps explain why practical helmets were preferred over ornamental ones. The Vikings were farmers, traders, and craftsmen as well as warriors. Their military equipment had to be affordable, maintainable, and effective. The iron required for weapons and armor was precious and had to be used efficiently. The elaborate bronze working techniques required for horned helmets were expensive and impractical for military purposes. The tactical requirements of Viking warfare also explain the preference for simple helmets. Vikings fought primarily with swords, axes, and spears in close combat situations where agility and protection were crucial. Horned helmets would have been actively dangerous in such combat, providing handholds for opponents and creating weak points in the armor. The horns would have made it difficult to use shields effectively and would have increased the risk of neck injury from the weight and leverage of the horns. The naval warfare that was central to Viking military strategy placed additional constraints on helmet design. Vikings fought from ships, where balance and mobility were essential. The weight and bulk of horned helmets would have made them impractical for shipboard combat. The risk of the horns catching on rigging or other equipment would have made them dangerous in the confined spaces of a longship. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age burials consistently shows that wealthy warriors were buried with practical military equipment rather than ceremonial ornaments. The graves contain well-made but functional swords, shields, and spearheads designed for actual warfare. The absence of horned helmets in these burials is particularly significant, since ceremonial items were commonly included in high-status burials if they had been part of Viking military culture. The international connections of the Vikings also influenced their military equipment. Viking warriors traveled throughout Europe and beyond, encountering different military traditions and technologies. The helmet styles found in Viking graves show influences from Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and other European traditions, all of which emphasized practical protection over ornamental display. The cross-cultural exchange of military technology worked against the development of uniquely Scandinavian. Ceremonial helmets. The social structure of Viking society provides another explanation for the absence of horned helmets. Unlike some other medieval cultures, Viking society was relatively egalitarian, with social status based more on wealth and achievement than on birth or ceremonial position. The warrior class was not a separate caste with distinctive ceremonial regalia, but rather consisted of farmers and traders who took up arms when necessary. Their military equipment reflected this practical, part-time nature of Viking warfare. The religious and ceremonial practices of the Vikings also differed from those of the Bronze Age cultures that had created horned helmets. While the Vikings had elaborate religious beliefs and practices, their ceremonies emphasized different symbols and objects. The horned helmet, with its possible associations with Bronze Age fertility and animal worship, did not fit into the Viking religious system, which emphasized different symbols and ceremonial objects. The technological capabilities of Viking Age metalworkers, while considerable, were focused on practical applications rather than elaborate ceremonial objects. The Vikings were skilled at producing weapons, tools, and jewelry, but their metalworking traditions emphasized functionality and efficiency. The complex bronzeworking techniques required for horned helmets were not part of their technological repertoire. The cultural values of Viking society also worked against the development of horned helmets. The sagas and other literary sources emphasize practical virtues like courage, loyalty, and skill in combat. The culture valued warriors who were effective fighters rather than those who looked impressive. The notion of wearing impractical equipment for ceremonial purposes would have been foreign to Viking military culture. The evidence from Viking Age art and iconography consistently shows warriors wearing simple, practical helmets or no helmets at all. The carved stones, metalwork, and other artistic productions of the period depict warriors in realistic combat situations, emphasizing their weapons and actions rather than their appearance. The absence of horned helmets in this contemporary art is particularly significant. The comparison between Viking military equipment and that of other European cultures of the same period reveals the practical nature of Viking warfare. The Franks, Anglo-Saxons, and other contemporary peoples also used simple, functional helmets without ornamental horns. The horned helmet was not a feature of early medieval European warfare in general, not just of Viking warfare specifically. The persistence of the horned helmet myth in popular culture, despite overwhelming archaeological evidence against it, reveals the power of cultural imagery to override factual evidence. The myth serves psychological and cultural needs that mere historical accuracy cannot satisfy. It provides a dramatic visual symbol that makes the Vikings seem more exotic and impressive than they would appear in simple iron helmets. The real Vikings, as revealed by archaeology and historical research, were remarkable enough without fictional embellishments. They were skilled sailors who reached North America 500 years before Columbus. Sophisticated traders who established commercial networks from Greenland to Constantinople. And adaptable settlers who established lasting communities throughout Europe. Their achievements in navigation, exploration, and cultural adaptation were far more impressive than any mythical horned helmet could make them. The story of the horned helmet myth reveals the complex relationship between historical evidence and popular culture. It shows how cultural needs and artistic conventions can create facts that become more real than reality itself. The myth demonstrates the power of visual imagery to shape historical understanding, and the difficulty of correcting misconceptions once they become embedded. In popular culture, the question that emerges from this examination is not just whether Vikings wore horned helmets, but why this particular myth proved so durable and what its persistence reveals about our relationship with the past. The warriors who sailed from Scandinavia to raid and settle across Europe were remarkable figures whose real achievements far exceeded any fictional enhancements. But somehow, the myth has proven more appealing than the reality, more memorable than the truth. On the morning of May 6, 1821, in the humid tropical heat of the island of St. Helena, a group of British officials gathered around a deathbed to perform one of history's most carefully documented measurements. The man whose body they were examining had once commanded armies across Europe, had crowned himself Emperor of France, and had reshaped the political landscape of an entire continent. Now, in death, Napoleon Bonaparte would be subjected to the mundane indignity of having his height recorded by his captors, a measurement that would become the foundation of one of history's most persistent myths. The British physician who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Francesco Antamarchi, recorded Napoleon's height as 5 feet 2 inches. This measurement, carefully noted in the official records of his death, would become the basis for the enduring belief that Napoleon was unusually short for his time. The figure was precise, official, and seemingly incontrovertible. It was also, in terms of its historical interpretation, fundamentally misleading. The source of the confusion lay not in the accuracy of the measurement itself, but in the different systems of measurement used in early 19th century Europe. The French foot used in Napoleon's time was longer than the English foot that would later become standard. When Antamarchi recorded Napoleon's height as 5 feet 2 inches, he was using French measurements, which translated to approximately 5 feet 6 inches in English measurements. This difference of 4 inches would prove to be historically significant, transforming a man of average height into an enduring symbol of diminutive stature. The confusion was compounded by the fact that Napoleon's height had been recorded multiple times during his life using different measurement systems and under different circumstances. His military records, dating from his enrollment in the French Royal Military School, listed his height as 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements. His passport, issued for his exile to Elba, gave the same measurement. These consistent records seemed to confirm his short stature, but they were all using the same French measurement system that was longer than its English equivalent. The reality of Napoleon's height, when properly converted to modern measurements, reveals a man who was neither short nor tall by the standards of his time. At approximately 5 feet 6 inches, he was slightly above average height for French men of the late 18th century. The average height for men in France during Napoleon's lifetime was about 5 feet 4 inches, making him actually taller than most of his contemporaries. The image of Napoleon as a short man, struggling to compensate for his physical inadequacy, was not based on any objective assessment of his stature. Relative to his peers, the perpetuation of the short Napoleon myth was not simply a matter of measurement confusion. It was actively promoted by British propaganda during the Napoleonic Wars, as part of a broader campaign to diminish Napoleon's reputation and authority. The British press, government officials, courtiers, all found political advantage in portraying Napoleon as physically diminutive, suggesting that his military and political achievements were somehow compensation for his supposed physical inadequacy. The most influential creator of the short Napoleon image was James Gillray, the brilliant British caricaturist whose satirical drawings shaped public opinion throughout the Napoleonic period. Gillray's cartoons consistently portrayed Napoleon as a tiny, rage-filled figure, often shown stamping his feet or throwing tantrums like a child. These images were not attempts at realistic portraiture, but political weapons designed to undermine Napoleon's authority and make him appear ridiculous to British audiences. Gillray's most famous cartoon, Maniac Cravings or Little Boney in a Strong Fit, 1803, showed Napoleon as a diminutive figure dwarfed by his own furniture, tearing his hair out in rage while surrounded by overturned chairs and tables. The cartoon was based on a real diplomatic incident in which Napoleon had lost his temper with the British ambassador. But Gillray's visual interpretation transformed a moment of political tension into a scene of childish petulance. the nickname Little Bony Stuck, and Gilray continued to use it in subsequent cartoons. The effectiveness of Gilray's propaganda was enhanced by the wide circulation of his prints. His cartoons were displayed in shop windows, reproduced in newspapers, and distributed throughout Britain and Europe. They reached audiences who might never have seen Napoleon in person, creating a visual image that was more influential than any written description. The cumulative effect of these images was to establish the idea of Napoleon as a small, angry man in the minds of the British public. The British government's support for anti-Napoleon propaganda was not accidental. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other government departments understood the power of visual imagery to shape public opinion and were willing to support artists and writers who could effectively ridicule Britain's enemies. Gilray and other caricaturists received unofficial government support for their work, making their anti-Napoleon cartoons part of a broader war effort. The persistence of the short Napoleon myth was also aided by the accounts of British visitors to St. Helena, where Napoleon spent his final years in exile. These visitors, many of whom were already predisposed to view Napoleon negatively, often described him as shorter than they had expected. Their accounts, published in British newspapers and magazines, reinforced the image of Napoleon as a physically diminutive figure. The fact that many of these visitors were comparing Napoleon to their own expectations, which had been shaped by years of British propaganda, was rarely acknowledged. The memoirs of Napoleon's contemporaries provide a very different picture of his physical presence. Those who knew him personally consistently described him as being of average height for his time, neither remarkably short nor tall. General Henry Gadian Bertrand, who served as Napoleon's aide-de-camp and accompanied him to St. Helena, recorded detailed observations of Napoleon's physical appearance that contradict the short emperor myth. Bertrand noted that Napoleon's height was ordinary, and that he had a well-proportioned figure. The accounts of foreign diplomats and military officers who met Napoleon during his career also contradict the short emperor image. Prince Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister who negotiated with Napoleon on several occasions, described him as being of medium height with an imposing presence. The Russian general Mikhail Kutuzov, who faced Napoleon at the Battle of Oster, made no mention of Napoleon's height in his reports, but focused instead on his tactical skills and personal charisma. The paintings and sculptures of Napoleon, created during his lifetime, provide additional evidence about his actual appearance. The artists who worked from life, rather than from imagination or propaganda, consistently portrayed Napoleon as a man of normal proportions. Yockley David's famous painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, shows the emperor as a figure of normal height relative to the other people in the scene. The sculptor Antonio Canova, who created several busts of Napoleon from life, portrayed him with normal facial proportions that would have been distorted if he had been unusually short. The uniforms and personal belongings that survived from Napoleon's lifetime also provide evidence about his actual size. The uniforms preserved in museums show that Napoleon wore standard sizes for his period, neither unusually small nor large. His boots, hats, and other personal items are all consistent with a man of average height for his time. The famous bicorn hat that became Napoleon's trademark was made in a standard size that would have been appropriate for a man of normal stature. The military records from Napoleon's campaigns provide another source of evidence about his height. Relative to his contemporaries, the height requirements for the French Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite troops, were carefully documented, and Napoleon himself met these requirements. The fact that he could serve alongside his guards without appearing noticeably shorter suggests that his height was within the normal range for military personnel of his time. The persistence of the short Napoleon myth, despite this overwhelming evidence, reveals the power of political propaganda to create lasting historical misconceptions. The British campaign to diminish Napoleon's reputation was so successful that it continues to influence popular understanding of his character more than 2 centuries after his death. The myth serves no historical purpose other than to make Napoleon appear ridiculous. But it has proven remarkably resistant to factual correction. The psychological appeal of the short Napoleon myth may also explain its persistence. The idea that Napoleon's military and political achievements were somehow compensatory for his physical inadequacy provides a simple explanation for his extraordinary career. It suggests that his ambition was driven by personal insecurity rather than genuine ability, making his achievements seem less impressive and his ultimate defeat more satisfying. The Napoleon complex, the psychological theory that short men are more aggressive and ambitious to compensate for their height, was explicitly based on the myth of Napoleon's short stature. This theory, while lacking scientific support, has become part of popular psychology and continues to influence how people understand the relationship between physical appearance and personality. The myth of Napoleon's height has thus created a psychological theory that outlived its historical foundation. The modern study of Napoleon's height using scientific methods has definitively established that he was not unusually short for his time. Historians have carefully examined the measurement systems used in early 19th century France, compared contemporary accounts of Napoleon's appearance, and analyzed the physical evidence from his personal belongings. The consensus among serious historians is that Napoleon was of average height for his period, neither short nor tall by the standards of his time. The question that emerges from this examination is not whether Napoleon was short, but why this particular myth proved so durable, and what its persistence reveals about the power of propaganda to shape historical understanding. The myth of Napoleon's short stature was not an innocent mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate political weapon that has outlived its original purpose. It demonstrates how effectively visual imagery and persistent repetition can create facts that become more real than reality itself. The power of a single artist to shape historical understanding becomes vividly apparent when examining the career of James Gillray, the British caricaturist whose satirical genius transformed public perception of Napoleon from that of a formidable military leader into a diminutive, rage-filled figure of ridicule. Working from his cramped studio above a print shop in London's St. James's Street, Gillray wielded his pen with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a propagandist, creating images that would influence popular understanding of Napoleon for centuries to come. Gillray's transformation of Napoleon's image was not accidental, but methodical. Evolving through dozens of cartoons published between 1798 and 1815, the artist understood that effective propaganda required consistency and repetition, gradually building a visual narrative that would become fixed in public consciousness. His early cartoons portrayed Napoleon as a competent but boastful military commander. But as the political situation between Britain and France deteriorated, Gillray's depictions became increasingly savage and personally demeaning. The breakthrough moment came with the cartoon Maniac Ravings or Little Boney in A Strong Fit 1803, which established both the visual template and the nickname that would define Napoleon in British popular culture. The cartoon was based on a real diplomatic incident that had occurred on March 14, 1803. At the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where Napoleon had publicly berated Lord Whitworth, the British ambassador, in front of hundreds of European diplomats. The incident had been reported in British newspapers as evidence of Napoleon's diplomatic incompetence and emotional instability. Gillray's interpretation of this incident was brilliantly calculated to maximize its propaganda value, rather than showing Napoleon as a dangerous enemy whose anger might be justified. Gillray portrayed him as a child having a tantrum. The Napoleon in the cartoon is dwarfed by his own furniture, his boots comically oversized, his hair wild with rage. The speech bubbles surrounding him are filled with incoherent threats and boasts, suggesting that his anger is irrational and his power illusory. The overall effect is to transform a moment of political tension into a scene of comic impotence. The genius of Gilray's approach lay in his understanding that political effectiveness often matters more than literal accuracy. The real Napoleon was not particularly short, but making him appear diminutive served multiple propaganda purposes. It made him seem less physically threatening, suggested that his achievements were compensatory rather than genuine, and provided a visual metaphor for Britain's supposed superiority over France. The cartoon Napoleon became more politically useful than the real Napoleon, and therefore more influential in shaping public opinion. The distribution network for Gilray's cartoons was sophisticated and far-reaching. His prints were published by Hannah Humphrey, who operated one of London's most successful print shops. The cartoons were displayed in shop windows, where they attracted crowds of viewers who might never have purchased them. They were reproduced in newspapers, copied by other artists, and distributed throughout Britain and Europe. The visual impact of these images was enhanced by their accessibility to both literate and illiterate audiences. The economic model underlying Gilray's propaganda was crucial to its success. His cartoons were profitable commercial products, not just political statements. The market for satirical prints was large and growing, driven by increasing literacy, political engagement, and disposable income among the middle classes. Gilray's anti-Napoleon cartoons were particularly popular because they combined political commentary with personal ridicule, appealing to both patriotic sentiment and simple entertainment. The British government's relationship with Gilray was complex and often unofficial. While there is no evidence of direct government payment for his anti-Napoleon cartoons, government officials clearly appreciated their propaganda value. Ministers and diplomats sometimes provided Gilray with inside information about political developments, and the timing of his cartoons often coincided with government policy initiatives. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Gilray gained access to newsworthy material, while the government gained an effective propaganda tool. The psychological impact of Gilray's cartoons on Nitzer's public opinion was profound. The repeated portrayal of Napoleon as Little Boney created a collective image that was more powerful than any single cartoon. British audiences came to see Napoleon not as a brilliant military strategist or effective administrator, but as a petulant child whose achievements were somehow illegitimate. This psychological transformation made it easier for the British public to support the long and costly wars against France. The international circulation of Gilray's cartoons extended their influence far beyond Britain. His prints were smuggled into France and other European countries where they were reproduced and adapted by local artists. The image of Napoleon as a diminutive, rage-filled figure became part of the visual vocabulary of European political satire, even in countries that were allies of France. Gilray's cartoons influenced how people visualized Napoleon and his regime. The technical brilliance of Gilray's work was as important as its political message. His mastery of etching and engraving techniques allowed him to create images of extraordinary detail and visual impact. His ability to capture physical likenesses while simultaneously distorting them for satirical effect demonstrated both artistic skill and psychological insight. The quality of his work ensured that his cartoons would be preserved and reproduced, extending their influence across time as well as space. The evolution of Gilray's Napoleon image reflected changing British attitudes toward the French leader. In the early cartoons, Napoleon appeared as a competent but dangerous enemy. As the wars continued and British confidence grew, the cartoons became more dismissive and personally insulting. The final cartoons, published during Napoleon's exile to St. Helena, portrayed him as a broken, pathetic figure whose previous power had been illusory. This narrative arc provided a satisfying, emotional journey for British audiences. The influence of Gilray's work extended beyond the immediate political context of the Napoleonic Wars. His visual innovations in political caricature influenced generations of satirical artists, establishing conventions that are still used today. The technique of exaggerating physical characteristics to make political points, the use of visual metaphors to convey complex ideas, and the combination of humor with serious political commentary all became standard elements of political satire. The social context of Gilray's work reveals much about early 19th century British society. The popularity of his anti-Napoleon cartoons reflected not just political opposition to France, but also social anxieties about foreign influence, democratic ideas, and social change. The portrayal of Napoleon as a diminutive upstart who had risen above his proper station resonated with British audiences who were themselves grappling with questions of social mobility and political reform. The gender dynamics of Gilray's Napoleon cartoons also reflected contemporary British attitudes. The portrayal of Napoleon as effeminate, emotionally unstable, and physically inadequate drew on stereotypes about masculinity and national character that were common in British culture. The contrast between the manly British character and the supposedly effeminate French character was a recurring theme in British propaganda of the period. The class implications of Gilray's work were equally significant. The cartoons consistently portrayed Napoleon as a social climber who had risen beyond his proper station, reflecting British anxieties about social mobility and political change. The emphasis on Napoleon's supposed physical inadequacy served as a metaphor for his social and political illegitimacy, suggesting that his achievements were somehow fraudulent or compensatory. The religious dimensions of Gilray's anti-Napoleon propaganda were also important. Many of his cartoons portrayed Napoleon as a figure of evil or as the Antichrist, drawing on Protestant traditions of anti-Catholic sentiment. The association of Napoleon with religious evil added a moral dimension to the political opposition, making the war against France seem like a crusade rather than a mere political conflict. The persistence of Gilray's Napoleon image into the modern era demonstrates the lasting power of effective visual propaganda. Long after the political context that created these images had disappeared, the visual stereotype of Napoleon as a short, angry man continued to influence popular understanding of his character. Modern films, books, and other cultural products still draw on visual conventions established by Gilray more than 2 centuries ago. The legacy of Gilray's work raises important questions about the relationship between art and historical truth. His cartoons were brilliantly effective as propaganda, but they created a false image of Napoleon that has proven remarkably resistant to factual correction. The artistic success of these images has made them more influential than historical evidence in shaping popular understanding of one of history's most important figures. The study of Gilray's Napoleon cartoons reveals how effectively visual imagery can be used to shape political opinion and historical understanding. The transformation of Napoleon from a formidable military leader into Little Boney was not an accident of historical transmission, but a deliberate creation of political propaganda. The persistence of this image demonstrates the power of effective visual communication to create facts that become more real than reality itself. The question that emerges from this examination is not just how Gilray created the image of Napoleon as a short man, but why this particular myth proved so durable and what its persistence reveals about the power of propaganda to shape historical understanding. The real Napoleon was a complex figure whose achievements and failures deserve serious historical analysis. But the cartoon Napoleon created by Gilray has proven more memorable and influential than the historical record. The final resolution of the Napoleon height myth requires us to move beyond the realm of political propaganda and cultural prejudice into the more precise world of historical metrology, the science of measurement systems. The task of determining Napoleon's actual height involves not just archaeological investigation and documentary analysis, but also the careful reconstruction of the measurement standards used in early 19th century France. This scientific approach reveals not only the truth about Napoleon's stature, but also the complex ways in which historical myths can be perpetuated by seemingly objective data. The fundamental source of confusion about Napoleon's height lay in the differences between French and English measurement systems during the early 19th century. The French foot, or pied ROI royal foot, was established by Louis XIV in 1668 and remained the standard unit of length in France until the adoption of the metric system during the Revolution. This French foot measured 32.484 centimeters, making it approximately 7.5% longer than the English foot, which measured 30.48 centimeters. This difference, while seemingly small, was enough to transform a man of average height into an apparent dwarf when measurements were interpreted using the wrong system. The precise measurement of Napoleon's height was recorded multiple times. During his lifetime and immediately after his death, his military records from the École Militaire, where he enrolled in 1784, listed his height as 5 pieds 2 pouces 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements. This same measurement was recorded on his passport for his exile to Elba in 1814. And it was confirmed by Dr. Francesco Antomarchi during the autopsy conducted on St. Helena in 1821. The consistency of these measurements across different times and circumstances would seem to confirm Napoleon's short stature. However, when these measurements are converted to modern metric units, a very different picture emerges. The French 5 pieds 2 pouces translates to approximately 1.69 meters, or about 5 feet 6.5 inches in English measurements. This height was not only average for French men of Napoleon's generation, but actually slightly above average. Studies of military recruitment records from the late 18th century show that the average height of French soldiers was approximately 1.65 meters, 5 feet 5 inches, making Napoleon taller than the typical Frenchman of his time. The confusion between French and English measurements was not accidental, but was actively exploited by British propaganda. British writers and caricaturists who had access to French records showing Napoleon's height as 5 feet 2 inches deliberately chose to interpret these measurements using English standards, making Napoleon appear shorter than he actually was. This manipulation was not necessarily conscious deception, but it reflected the broader British effort to diminish Napoleon's reputation and authority. The eyewitness accounts of Napoleon's height from those who knew him personally provide additional evidence against the short emperor myth. General Henry Gatien Bertrand, who served as Napoleon's aide-de-camp and accompanied him to St. Helena, kept detailed diaries that included descriptions of Napoleon's physical appearance. Bertrand, who had every opportunity to observe Napoleon closely over many years, described him as being of ordinary height and noted that he had a well-proportioned figure that commanded respect. The Marquis de Caulaincourt, who served as Napoleon's master of the horse and accompanied him on numerous campaigns, provided similar testimony about Napoleon's physical presence. In his memoirs, Caulaincourt described Napoleon as having an imposing bearing and noted that his height was in no way remarkable, meaning that it was neither unusually short nor tall. These accounts from close associates who had no reason to exaggerate Napoleon's height provide credible evidence against the short emperor myth. Foreign diplomats and military officers who met Napoleon during his career also left records that contradict the image of a short emperor. Prince Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister who negotiated with Napoleon on several occasions, described him as being of medium height with a commanding presence. The Prussian general Gebhard Leberacht von Blücher, who faced Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, made no mention of Napoleon's height in his reports, but focused instead on his tactical skills and personal charisma. The comparative analysis of Napoleon's height relative to his contemporaries reveals the absurdity of the short emperor myth. Louis XVI, the French king whom Napoleon eventually replaced, was recorded as being 6 feet tall, making him unusually tall for his time. The contrast between the tall king and the supposedly short emperor provided a convenient visual metaphor for British propaganda. But it was based on a false premise about Napoleon's actual height. The analysis of Napoleon's personal belongings provides additional evidence about his actual size. The uniforms preserved in museums show that Napoleon wore standard sizes for his period, neither unusually small nor large. His boots, which are preserved in several European museums, are size 40 in the French system, equivalent to a modern size 7 US or 6.5 UK. This shoe size is consistent with a man of average height for his time period, the famous bicorn hat. That became Napoleon's trademark, was made in a standard size that would have been appropriate for a man of normal stature. The hat, which is preserved in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, has a circumference of 57 centimeters, which is average for adult men. If Napoleon had been unusually short, his head would likely have been proportionally smaller, requiring a smaller hat size. That the artistic evidence from Napoleon's lifetime also contradicts the short emperor myth. The portraits painted by Jacques-Louis David, who had numerous opportunities to observe Napoleon closely, show him as a man of normal proportions. David's famous painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, depicts the emperor as being of average height relative to the other figures in the scene, including his wife Josephine and various court officials whose heights are independently documented. The sculptural evidence provides another source of information about Napoleon's actual appearance. The busts created by Antonio Canova, who worked from life rather than imagination, show Napoleon with normal facial proportions that would have been distorted if he had been unusually short. The death mask created immediately after Napoleon's death on St. Helena also shows normal facial proportions consistent with a man of average height. The modern scientific study of Napoleon's height has employed sophisticated techniques to resolve the measurement confusion. Historians have carefully analyzed the French measurement systems used during Napoleon's lifetime, compared contemporary accounts of his appearance, and examined the physical evidence from his personal belongings. The consensus among serious historians is that Napoleon was of average height for his period, neither short nor tall by the standards of his time. The persistence of the short Napoleon myth, despite this overwhelming evidence, reveals the power of cultural stereotypes to override factual information. The myth serves psychological and political purposes that mere historical accuracy cannot satisfy. It provides a simple explanation for Napoleon's extraordinary career, suggesting that his achievements were somehow compensatory rather than genuine. The myth also serves to diminish Napoleon's reputation, making his ultimate defeat seem more satisfying and his opponents more heroic. The Napoleon complex, the psychological theory that short men are more aggressive and ambitious to compensate for their height, was explicitly based on the myth of Napoleon's short stature. This theory, while lacking scientific support, has become part of popular psychology and continues to influence how people understand the relationship between physical appearance and personality. The myth of Napoleon's height has thus created a psychological framework that has outlived its historical foundation. The broader implications of the Napoleon height myth extend beyond the particulars of one historical figure. The myth demonstrates how effectively political propaganda can create lasting historical misconceptions, how cultural stereotypes can resist factual correction, and how scientific methods can be used to resolve historical controversies. The story of Napoleon's height reveals the complex relationship between historical evidence and popular belief, showing how myths can become more influential than facts in shaping our understanding of the past. The resolution of the Napoleon height myth also raises questions about the nature of historical truth and the responsibility of historians to correct popular misconceptions. The scientific evidence clearly shows that Napoleon was not unusually short, but the myth continues to influence popular culture, and casual historical discussion. The persistence of the myth suggests that historical truth is not simply a matter of accumulating facts, but of understanding how cultural needs and psychological preferences shape our interpretation of evidence. The ultimate lesson of Napoleon's height is not just that he was taller than commonly believed, but that the process of historical understanding is more complex and contested than it might initially appear. The transformation of a man of average height into a symbol of diminutive stature reveals how effectively cultural forces can reshape historical reality. The myth of Napoleon's height continues to influence popular understanding of one of history's most important figures, demonstrating the enduring power of propaganda to shape our perception of the past. As we reach the end of our journey through these 4 historical myths, we find ourselves confronting a troubling question. Why do demonstrably false stories about the past prove so resistant to correction? The evidence we have examined tonight, from medieval astronomical calculations to Bronze Age helmet fragments, from 18th century court records to 19th century measurement standards, provides overwhelming proof that each of these myths is factually incorrect. Yet they persist in popular culture, educational materials, and casual conversation with remarkable tenacity. The medieval flat Earth myth continues to shape our understanding of the Middle Ages, despite abundant evidence that medieval scholars calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The "let them eat cake" attribution to Marie Antoinette remains fixed in popular consciousness despite clear documentation that the phrase predated her by decades. The image of horned Vikings dominates popular culture despite the complete absence of any archaeological evidence for such headgear. The belief in Napoleon's short stature persists despite precise measurements showing he was of average height for his time. These myths share common characteristics that explain their durability. Each provides a simple, memorable story that reduces complex historical realities to easily digestible narratives. Each serves contemporary psychological or political needs by confirming modern prejudices about the past. Each transforms complicated historical figures into simple stereotypes that are easier to understand and remember than the complex realities they replace. The flat Earth myth allows us to feel superior to our ancestors, confirming our belief in the inevitability of human progress. The cake myth provides a convenient symbol of aristocratic callousness that explains complex social and political upheavals. The horned helmet myth transforms practical warriors into exotic legends that seem more dramatic than historical reality. The Napoleon height myth reduces a complex military and political genius to a simple, psychological case study. Perhaps most importantly, these myths reveal our own relationship with the past. They show how we construct historical narratives to serve present purposes, how we prefer dramatic fiction to mundane reality, and how we use the past to validate our contemporary beliefs and values. The persistence of these myths tells us less about medieval scholars, 18th century queens, Viking warriors, or French emperors than it does about ourselves and our need for simple stories in a complex world. The cost of historical mythology extends far beyond academic accuracy. These false narratives impoverish our understanding of human achievement, reduce complex historical figures to simple caricatures, and perpetuate prejudices that distort our view of both past and present. They demonstrate how easily truth can be displaced by appealing fiction, how effectively propaganda can shape lasting beliefs, and how difficult it is to correct misconceptions once they become embedded in popular culture. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the stories we tell ourselves about the past and the purposes they serve. The real history of medieval scholars calculating the Earth's circumference. Of a queen trapped by circumstances beyond her control, of practical warriors adapting to survive in a harsh world, of a military genius whose achievements speak for themselves as far more remarkable than any mythological embellishment. But somehow we continue to prefer the fiction to the reality, the myth to the truth. The question that remains is whether we have the courage to abandon comfortable myths in favor of complex truths, whether we can appreciate the past for what it actually was rather than what we wish it had been, and whether we can learn to find the extraordinary within the ordinary rather than manufacturing the extraordinary from whole cloth. The scholars, queens, warriors, and emperors of the past deserve better than the myths we have created about them. More importantly, we deserve better than the simplified, distorted understanding of human history that these myths provide. In the end, the most boring history may be the most truthful history, not because it lacks drama or significance, but because it reveals the authentic human experience of those who came before us. The real past, with all its complexity and contradiction, offers lessons and insights that no mythology can provide. But learning these lessons requires us to abandon the comforting fiction of simple stories and embrace the challenging reality of complex truth. Sleep well, and dream of the past as it actually was, remarkable enough without embellishment, complex enough to reward careful study, and human enough to offer genuine understanding of the long journey that brought us to where we are today.